Welcome to Innovating Clinical Trials, the podcast designed for clinical research professionals eager to deepen their understanding of clinical trials through concise, insightful segments. Join your hosts, Liam Eves and Ted Trafford, as they uncover the core issues in clinical research, reflect on the industry, and challenge conventional wisdom.
Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Jill Fikowski, founder and CEO of Changemark Research Plus Evaluation. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, be sure to go back and check it out. We discussed what community and patient engagement looks like in substance use clinical trials and the need for knowledge translation of updates and results. Now on to part 2.
You mentioned about, obviously the first research that it seemed to touch so many parts of you that you're obviously massively passionate about, and it's been done seemingly very well. What does good look like to you against maybe the normal or the bad?
Yeah.
What are the few things where that you can really sort of touch upon and say, okay, that to me is good?
Well, I've seen the successful studies that I've seen. I've seen them involve community from the very, very beginning, right? And when you involve community from the very beginning, you can get a gauge of what's good by involving them all the way along, saying, are we doing this right? When we did this activity, did that land? What did you think about these early stage findings? Do you think that we should try something else when we're trying to recruit? The community is telling you what's working simply by, how many folks you're recruiting, good engagement activities. Is the community receptive to what you're doing? What are the attitudes toward the study in the community, right? And it's like a study like that one I was saying, lots of people had issues with it, right? We had, I think, a 500-person wait list ready to get pre-screened on that trial. And people were like, oh, well, you're giving out heroin. And it's like, that's not why. People are looking for a solution. People are looking for help. And so, we had a 500-person wait list. But I think the measure of what's good enough is really how the community is feeling about the relationship with the researcher and how the community is responding to what you're doing along the way.
Yeah.
Right. And in the end, what do you do with those findings? It's amazing to me. I've seen some incredible researchers, don't get me wrong, in investigator-initiated trials. But the system, the colonial system of academia and grant making, so for some of these federal grants, they're not conducive to community input and time taken and time afterwards. They are, you get grants, you excel within your academic institution. You get funding, you advance within your academic institution, right? So there's not a lot of why are we doing this? Is it that important that we want to change policy? As much as I want to try and get as much money and get this research because academics are under their own pressure.
Yeah.
Right? So this researcher who we worked with on that injectable heroin study, yeah, sure, she wanted to advance her position. Sure, there was an element of that. I didn't pick up on it. And I'm almost certain her team didn't either. And it was, how can we get this, people access to this? How can we get this approved in this country to help people? And that was the leadership message on the team, right? That kept all of us engaged. That kept us, going above and beyond to engage community because we saw our PI and how our PI thought about engaging and involving community. That's what kept us going and motivated, right? Is because we believed in what was happening, right?
There's obviously a significant difference between investigator-initiated studies and funded clinical trials.
Yes.
And sponsored clinical trials. Yeah. Have you seen, because you mentioned involving community from the beginning and then all the way along, have you actually seen that in pharmaceutical sponsored clinical trials, or are we still just kind of scratching at the surface on that?
I haven't, but I will say my experience with investigator-initiated studies is about 25 years, and my experience with sponsored industry is about 5.
Okay.
So that's just my N of 1 experience with sponsors. I'm sure that there are some sponsors doing well. I think that there are just spaces right now where capitalism plays a huge role in what's done research-wise and the time it takes and, enrollment, retention. We have to get there first. We have to close. Can we publish these findings because our stocks will go up? Can we do this because our investors are asking this? The pressures in industry, I talked about the pressures in academia. Pressures in industry are just different. They're business pressures. So what I've found when working with industry, and this is why we as a company are very selective on who we work with sponsor-wise, because business and research don't line up well oftentimes, right? Is especially when everybody is in a hustle to get there first. I don't know if y'all are, familiar with the area of psychedelics right now. And I am not a psychedelics expert. I am not going to go into proposing to know the ins and outs of everything. But there's a hustle right now. There's a hustle. Like Trump's signed an executive order for Ibogaine. And, all these psychedelic manufacturers are trying to get there first and have the best latest drug and all this kind of stuff, right? And, things in that get missed. And we've gotten rid of clients because of this. So I will fully pass up revenue if I think that participant safety is at risk or there's an ethical consideration. I will fully pass it up because there's just no way values-wise we can be associated with that, right? But we were involved with one sponsor. I won't use the drug name because it'll be a giveaway. But we were involved.
Please don't.
We were involved. Yeah. We were involved with one sponsor. And he had several investors in this drug, this type of drug. This type of drug had an incredibly high safety risk profile. So there was very limited safety data around it. Regulators had a huge problem with it. They're like, this shouldn't really be on the market. It should be tested safety first. Like, we don't know. But he had a whole bunch of investors, millions of dollars wrapped up in wanting to do this trial. So he called me up and he said, we'd done the evidence review, we'd done the literature review. He said, here's the dosing that we recommend based on the existing safety data, all this kind of stuff. And he said, well, we have to increase the dose. And we said, well, we're not increasing it beyond what the parameters are in the evidence and the safety data. And he said, no, we have to increase it. This has to work. I want it increased. So now you have sponsor interference based on really ignorance around dosing requirements, thinking the more you do, the faster it'll work, right? But there's a desperation there when there's investor dollars at risk or, reputation or advancement or money. It changes the game a little bit, right? Like, what happens if they do a research study, invest millions of dollars, and there's really not any efficacy findings that are worth publishing? Then what?
Well, right? That happens all the time.
It happens all the time. But this game right now is, in certain areas, can get really, a little bit of. I've experienced that as well. So
yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? I mean, you get the behaviors you incentivize for, and as you say, it's a very competitive space.
Yeah.
But we need to be doing it the right way. Yeah. And it just in terms of like those community, just sort of like touching back on this community pieces, is that what does that look like, Jill, in terms of like the engagement, the process? And I'm also really interested to know is, have you had experiences where groups have told you things that, sponsors, whether it be academia or pharma, where just no one's thought about those things, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is like a real sort of like revelation or an insight that we've just never considered?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I was talking to Ted a little bit about this, and I have actually good and bad examples of when community engagement and involvement from the beginning would have benefited trials, and examples where it actually has. So there was an amazing researcher in Quebec who works in cannabis research. And the parallel trials were app-based technology for youth who use cannabis with psychosis. So very hard to engage population, right? Like these are youth who are coming into contact with care. We have potential, relationship, trust of the system, recruitment issues, retention, so there's a lot kind of on the line here. So making sure we engage in a good way. Well, what the researchers did from the beginning was they got, the youth involved in the protocol development and review committee. And they said, okay, and they didn't read a complicated scientific protocol to them. They pulled out pieces and translated that information back to the youth and said, okay, you know what? So if you were going to join a study, what would be important to you? Like, would this matter? Or, when you come into the clinic, what stops you from coming into the clinic? Like, what are some kind of like life stuff, or like, what gets in the way of you coming? All this information, right? So it's saying it helps you design recruitment strategies. Or saying, if you have a youth say, well, I'll only talk to my clinician. I won't talk to anyone else, right? So I don't want to talk to anybody else. Okay, that's really important, because if you have a research staff there and the youth isn't going to talk to them, they're not going to come in for the visit, right? So you find out all of these things that you would not know from the peer review literature, right?
And
yeah.
Does this happen like one-on-one with individual youth, or do you like Pharma is famous for their advisory boards? Like, do you actually bring them together as a group, or do you ask these questions one-on-one?
Oh, well, I think this team had a group, and the youth that came had been asked by the clinicians saying, hey, would you want to be involved in something like this? Clinicians who they already had a relationship with, right?
Right.
And so, so they showed up, and this happened, and they surpassed the recruitment target and retention target in this group. The youth, they were app-based technologies. The apps weren't built purely on clinician and peer-reviewed literature. The youth looked at the apps and said, oh, here's what I would change. No, I wouldn't answer this. No, I don't want it bugging me that much. Oh, no, this isn't how we think about things. Getting input on the intervention itself so that it was youth and clinician developed, right?
Mm-hmm.
What a concept. I think a lot of researchers think, well, no, I went to school and I have a PhD and I'm a physician and I know, right? But you're building these things for people who have the condition. So, nothing about us without us, right? So, you want to know if there's uptake before you go and spend millions of dollars putting together an intervention that's just based on the peer review literature.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it, Jill, is really like there's a behavioral aspect to these things, right? It's just as much, I would say, it's just as much psychology as it is logistics. And to your example is that I know that, like, I'll speak to my daughter who's 13 and she starts coming out with words and I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I have absolutely no idea about this new language that you're speaking. Or she'll just know how to use technology where I'm pretty technology advanced. And I'm like, well, what, how do you do that? What do you do? So I think that those type of things are really, really useful. I think equally when we're looking at perhaps older generations, there's a different need, right, to those people in which that they may not be like technologically advanced and so on and so forth. Where do you see any common threads when speaking to the communities about some of the breaking points where where you just get those, you just know, you're like, I know that most of these trials are going to stumble up around these three things. Are there like threads that you've surfaced over doing this work?
Well, I think, and this sounds like a quote soft skill, but it's actually not. It's actually critical for your hiring and developing a culture of research practices, but it's relationship. It's relationship. You when you're working with folks who might be distrustful of the colonial healthcare system, right? Or they might feel like when they walk in, they're going to get judged. Or they don't, they're scared to come in and say how much drugs they're really using because their doctor might cut off their prescription, or all these types of things. If you have a relationship with someone where you genuinely care about their well-being, they're far more likely to come in to want to see you because they know that they're not being judged. They know that there's not going to be any kind of, punitive kind of repercussions of them coming in. And so that relationship is absolutely key. And the relationship comes from caring about the person, not just the data points.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes in and they're sitting in front of me and I know that they're going to be hungry because they haven't eaten and maybe they missed the meal program or something like this, go to Subway and get a sub and a bag of chips before they come in. Don't sit in front of somebody who's hungry and have them give you data so that the researcher can go out and publish it. Nourish them, offer them a sandwich, treat them, if somebody is really struggling and right after the research visit, they say, I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. Get on the phone and call a shelter to see if there's a bed. These things take hardly any time. And personally, I actually think it's our responsibility to do small things like that. Right. Yeah. And, maybe research visits take 45 minutes and maybe Fred needs to talk for an hour and a half because he had a really bad day.
That's right.
And you make sure that you leave time for Fred in between your research visits, right? Because Fred's a talker.
It's really good. I actually spoke at a conference only last week about this very topic, which is relationship and trust, because a lot of those things, they are below the waterline, in the sense that they're not seen and they're not a line item in the budget. It's it's currency that we're building through an exchange of, like you say, I care for you, I trust you, I'm building a relationship. But it's often it's very hard for, I think, a lot of researchers to, if they are being, okay, you've only got this amount of time to do this amount of procedure, it relies very much on like the heroics of the site personnel, right? Rather than, okay, this is an activity. And I told the story of a lady that I very much did that. It was a dementia patient with her daughter, and I spent time with them, and it was the time that built that relationship, and then that trust existed as a result. So therefore she did about 4 or 5 trials with us. But I think it's all too often it's something that's missed, and it's not paid for in those line items, which is critical.
Oh no, I totally agree. And I think that when you take a look at the history of research in certain communities, right? Like, there's a incredible community in Vancouver referred to as the downtown east side of Vancouver. And historically, ever since the mid-90s with the HIV epidemic and whatnot that's been going on, researchers have kind of gone in, right? Because there's lots of stuff going on, right? And we could go and figure out all this stuff, right? And the term research to death, right, is a term that population uses, right? Where it's like, okay, yeah, I'm going to sit here and answer another survey, da-da-da. But there's that element of learned hopelessness around participation in research, where I'm going to sit down with you for an hour and I'm going to open up this box of maybe potentially trauma, my substance use. I'm going to give my time. I'm going to potentially risk myself from talking about these things after I leave, because no one asks after they leave how they were, right? It's like we got our data and we move on, right? But ultimately, it's when they see their information come out, nobody knows where it goes. Nobody sees policy change. No one sees, the lineup at the clinic get shorter. Nobody sees kind of things happen from this research. But the researchers kind of go in, take it, publish, go present at some big conference, advance in their career. And the community is like, well, yeah, but I've participated in so many surveys, but nothing's really changing, or no one told me what happened. Like, what's the attitude of research that's going to be in that community, right? And it's, you have to really care. You have to really care about the community and care about, them as human beings and truly not just data points.
And how do we get to that point? Like, what are some of the things that groups can do to sort of feed that information back? Because I think that there's different outcomes, right, to any of this research. One is that a thing doesn't work, or it marginally works, or it works really successfully.
Yeah.
And then there's a question to say, well, like you say, what are the impacts of that output? So a thing changes or it doesn't. So I think that when a thing changes, it's easier to see if it is indeed visible.
Sure.
But like, what are some of the things that like groups could think about doing to actually, even if it just feeding some of that information back into the community?
Yeah, partnership. I think that partnership with community organizations. If you're going and one of your sites is at a local community clinic, let that community clinic talk to their patients about what happened and tell them about what happened. Give some of the power back to that community organization to also share those findings in a way that the people who they know best are going to want to hear them. Maybe at a lunch, share a meal. Make sure when people show up, maybe that they're compensated, or they have bus tickets, or they have travel expenses covered. Give some of that back to the clinic to co-share. Research scientists, oftentimes I don't want to say easier for them to write up a manuscript and go attend a conference, but it's in their wheelhouse. It's something that they're familiar with and they know and they understand. So it's like, I'm going to write in manuscript and presentation at this conference. That's nice and safe. Okay, I know how to do that. That's in my skill set. Oh, wait, talk to community and go to a community event? Oh, I don't know. I wouldn't know the first place. That sounds like it takes too much time. And I don't know if I'd be any good at that. And I don't know what I would do. Like, what happens if people don't like the study? What do I have to do with that information? Right? So it's kind of just like, researchers in their defense, they're under this incredible pressure too, because there are certain things in the colonial academic system that are checkboxes that you need to meet. And those checkboxes are in all those spots where they feel really comfortable: manuscripts and presentations, funding, right? And so I would encourage researchers to learn from their community partner, talk about how they can co-share the information. How is the information collected given back to the community org so that maybe that nonprofit or community organization can go apply for some funding of their own to keep the funding going, right? So how are you sharing the data, right? Put a data sharing agreement in place.
It's been so great to have this conversation with Jill. Stream our next episode to listen to part 3. Did something from this episode give you an idea? Do you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the Innovating Clinical Trials podcast? If so, follow Innovating Clinical Trials on LinkedIn and message us there, or through our website at innovatingclinicaltrials.com.